If you're in the market for a powerful computer, Threadripper has probably caught your attention. I mean, it's just sort of raffle stomping its way through all of the different desktop applications that you might run for anybody that has anything even remotely seriously demanding. And the TRX40 creator from Asrock has probably caught your attention. That's what we're here today to do, to review this motherboard and see how it stacks up, because you might have noticed the VRM solution. It's 8 phases. Will this thing actually hold up with 32 cores? Will the longevity be there? What about the chipset fan? What about Linux? I'm Wendell, this is Level 1, and I'm here to answer all of your questions about this motherboard. Threadripper, yeah, Threadripper in the industry. I bet people at Intel are thinking, wow, if we could dodge a wrench, we could dodge 10 nanometer lithography problems. I don't know. Threadripper, it's hard not to notice Threadripper. It is literally curb stomping things. It's probably the fastest desktop processor that we've seen in 10 years, the biggest generational leap. Single NUMA node, yeah, but it's not gonna be compatible with first or second gen Threadripper motherboards. They had to make a lot of changes. And the TRX40 creator from Asrock is one of the least expensive, but still seems to have all the features of TRX40 motherboards that are available right now. And so we're here to take a look at that. But first, let's take a look at the physical layout of the board. Ah, the TRX40, the connoisseur's motherboard. It actually has 2 fans. There's the fan that's located here for the chipset, which is nicely out of the way of the graphics card, if I do say so myself. And then we've got another fan located up here up top for the VRM cooling. Now this is an 8-phase VRM, but strangely in testing, it really didn't get super hot. The components seem to be pretty high-end. The capacitors are very high-end ceramic capacitors. I mean, well, high-end I guess is a relative term. It depends on what you're doing in the implementation and that kind of thing. There's no backplate on this motherboard, so there's nothing to dissipate heat on this side of the motherboard, but the fan in this setup is actually surprisingly efficient. So I'm not gonna knock Asrock for this. We haven't seen the 64 core yet. I might be a little worried about the 64 core. I may need to revisit this motherboard once the 64 core is released. Theoretically, the 64 core is also gonna be in that 280 watt TDP, so that may only really affect you if you're doing overclocking. It does have dual 8-pin power connections, which, you know, that supports up to 800 watts through the CPU, but not really. You're gonna hit the limits of the motherboard long before then. Although the chokes and some of the other components here are up to 90 amps. So it is actually reasonably high end. Now, the audio solution here is a Realtek ALC 1220. It's a pretty standard layout for these kinds of motherboards, but you should know that all TRX motherboards have their audio attached through a USB that's actually tied to the south bridge. It's complicated, but it has to do with the reworking of the pin layout for the socket and not being able to export the HD audio function from, I mean, Threadripper is basically a server CPU, so if you think about it in that context, it kind of makes sense. But just know that the audio solution on Threadripper is going to be a little unusual. That matters more for Linux than Windows. It's pretty much plug and play on Windows. It shows up as an audio device as any other audio device. Not really an issue. It's going to be totally fine. It has dual front panel, 30-pin USB connections, one at the bottom, one at the front. USB Type-C, of course. Also at the front, we've got our motherboard power connections, our digital and analog RGB header strips. If you're into RGB, you've got that option at the front. It also has supplemental PCIe power just below the south bridge fan at the front edge of the motherboard, and 8 right-angle SATA connections. The motherboard also has a physical BIOS overclocking switch just below the 8-pin power connections at the top edge of the motherboard near the PS2 connection. And that is for disabling, among other things, processor hot. So if you want to be able to run your processor out of spec at a super hot temperature, you can throw that. It's like, all right, well, whatever, we'll just run, it'll be fine. This also has the new USB-C standard that's, you know, 20 gigabit, but it's on a little M.2 riser card. So Asrock it's actually pretty clever. They could manufacture their motherboards ahead of time and then just put the USB 2 20 gig or whatever other optional peripherals you want in this little M.2 slot that's right at the back I/O of the motherboard. This is pretty cool. There are 5 4-pin fan headers, 2 at the bottom edge, 2 just below the processor socket, and 1 in the top edge of the motherboard near the other 8-pin power connection. We also have 1 onboard USB 2.0 header, as well as a right angle front panel audio connection. So if you were going to try to use a bunch of GPUs with this motherboard, you could plug it in at the bottom here. Your fan connections, unfortunately, are not going to be cleared, nor is your USB 2 or 3 connection, but you would still be able to plug in your front panel audio. So it's nice of Asrock to include that. Also at the bottom edge of the motherboard are two LED strip headers, analog, one digital, an unsoldered Thunderbolt header. So perhaps we will see Thunderbolt support from Asrock for the TRX40 platform at some point in the future on a different model motherboard, perhaps. And finally, we have a diagnostic readout and a power and reset button on board. Those things are really underrated, and pretty much every motherboard, especially motherboards this pricey, should have that, because if you're building a relatively high-end system, the day that it won't boot, you need all the information that you could possibly get in order to figure that out. Now, in terms of PCI Express connectivity, it's got PCI Express 4 out the wazoo. The TRX40 platform in general from AMD is going to have 72 PCI Express lanes. It's up to the motherboard vendors to figure out how they're going to actually use those lanes. How Asrock has configured this, we've got 3 onboard PCI Express 4 M.2, 80 and 110 millimeter. It's a pretty good mix. And then we've also got 4 X16 expansion slots. Now, electrically, those are wired as X16, X8, X16, X8, coming down from the top to the bottom of the board. That will let you run up to 4 graphics cards, but we all know that we like to run peripherals, right? We can run X16 and X8 peripherals. At the rear I/O, we've got an Aquantia 10 gigabit NIC and a Realtek Dragon 2.5 gigabit NIC. We also have a mix of 5 and 10 gigabit USB ports and the aforementioned USB Type-C port, which is 20 gigabit. There is a reset, like a CMOS reset button next to your dual Wi-Fi antennas. And then we've also got a BIOS flashback button. What that'll do is when new CPUs come out, like the 64-core Threadripper that's coming, looming on the horizon, ready to raffle stomp even more, probably. We've got 2 USB 5 gigabit and PS2 combo. PS2 combo port, which is for your mouse and keyboard, like your old school PS2 mouse and keyboard, and the old school Model M's that I'm so fond of. Sing me the song of your people. Now the TRX40 platform is a quad channel platform, so ideally you're going to be using 4 sticks of memory with this thing. The more memory and the more ranks of memory that you have on TRX40, the lower the memory frequency goes. So officially, platform supports 3200 in the 32 gig configuration where you get 4 8 gig sticks, and it will drop down from there to 2666 if you're running 256 gigabytes. Yeah, this platform supports 256 gigs, which is really awesome. Good news though, with the Corsair Dominator memory, I was able to run 3600 with a 64 gigabyte kit. That's dual ranks, so 16 gigabytes per stick. I was also able to run Trident Z Neo 32 gig, 3600 of course, no problem. That is technically an overclock, so if you get a CPU that doesn't do it, you'll have to back off on that. You can also run your Infinity Fabric asynchronously with the memory speed. What that means in these processors is that the internal bus in the CPU is basically tied to the memory frequency by default, which lowers the latency. So if you can, you would benefit from running faster memory to a point. 3600 is kind of the sweet spot. You can run a little faster, but not so much on every CPU. 3600 is kind of safe so far, at least with the 4 Threadripper systems that I've built. Generally, 3600 was pretty safe on Ryzen desktop, and I built a lot more of those, so it's probably all right, just full disclosure. Now, this motherboard from Asrock officially supports up to 4666. At least that's what's printed on the box. That is an OC. I was not able to run past DDR4 4000 on this motherboard, however. So there you go. What's the catch with this motherboard? Well, the VRM solution is only 8-phase, but it's high-end. So that's not really a trade-off. It's got the onboard Aquantia 10 gig NIC, which is not something that every board in this price category, you know, around $500 could say. We do have a lot more expensive motherboards that you can move up to on the TRX40 platform, but you're gonna be spending, you know, $800–900 US on those motherboards. This motherboard's priced around $460 from Newegg at the time that I'm doing this video. And I gotta wonder, how's Asrock making any money at $460? I mean, $460 is very aggressively priced for the feature set on this motherboard. It doesn't really, I mean, it is Creator, it lives up to the name because you get the 10 gig Ethernet interface. Asrock also has the Pci, which eschews some of the features on this motherboard, like for instance, you could go to 3 slots instead of 4, but the PCI Express layout configuration changes a little bit on the Pci to give you some more options, and it also has the M.2 RAID card. But I think if I were building a system, I would probably go for an M.2 RAID 0, maybe a RAID 1 if I was worried about redundancy or I didn't really back up my stuff all that much, although RAID's not a backup. But I would probably do a RAID 1 or a RAID 0 with M.2 and this motherboard, because a 4 drive, I mean, that gets really kind of expensive. The 24 core paired with this motherboard would be excellent, although I tested with the 32 core and 32 core was no problem at all. This motherboard, the The VRM does have the heat pipe connection to the rear I/O shield, so it's not a fin stack or anything like that. It's just a big old block of aluminum, so it's more like a thermal capacitor than a heat sink. But all in all, this motherboard was I was a little worried about the VRM, but it was solid. It's a very solid motherboard, and honestly, I don't know how Asrock is making any money at this price point because this is very aggressively priced. Linux support on this motherboard is pretty good. Remember that the audio solution that comes off of the TRX40 chipset through USB, that can be a little sketchy depending on what your distros are. It is fixed up now though, so if you need audio support and you're having trouble, there's probably a workaround for your specific distro. Also, if your distro hangs on boot, that is probably a machine check exception. You can use page up or shift page up on most distros to scroll up and see a kernel panic. To work around that, all you need to do is add MCE = off to the kernel line. That'll disable the machine check exception. It's a one-line patch to the kernel. There's a thread for that on the level 1 forum that'll walk you through patching your kernel so that you can get up and running with a modern kernel and getting around the machine check exception problem. It's literally just trying to add the same machine check exception device per CPU twice. And that throws a panic because it tries to create a file that already exists. So it's a one-line patch. It's not really a big deal. It's pretty easy fixed. But Linux support, TRX, I mean, it's a 3rd generation Threadripper. Not a lot has changed from Linux's standpoint. The CPU is, of course, different under the hood. But in general, you'll have a really good experience with Linux, the one machine check exception problem aside. Well, it's time for Threadripper to get back to raffle stomping some curbs and curb stomping some raffles. And I don't know, it's a weird time. It's a weird time to be alive, to have CPUs that are this much faster than the prior gen. I'm not even talking about Intel versus AMD. I'm talking about the 2990WX 32 core, which was a much better experience on Linux than Windows. And the 32 core 3960, well, the 3970 and the 24 core 3960, those are some serious amounts of horsepower and CPUs. It's exciting. If you build a system with one of these, or you put something together, show it off in the level 1 forums. I'd love to see pics of what y'all are building and how you put it together and what your experiences are with boards like these, because, I just get to play with 1 or 2 or 5, but collectively, all of you, hundreds of these. And so knowing what your experiences are, good or bad, that helps me. And it helps me sort of plot a roadmap and plan my update videos and that sort of thing. I might have liked to have seen an Intel NIC on board instead of the Dragon. That would make it more appropriate for, like super home server or like running VMware ESXi, because VMware doesn't really like the 2.5 gig NIC or the Aquantia NIC. But those aren't really issues for Linux workstations or big boy Threadripper workstations or, really anything like that. I can't imagine that that would really be much of an issue outside of trying to use something like this for like an off-label quasi server type situation, or like a test server or a dev server. So that's not really anything to complain about. Overall, good job, Asrock. I'm Wendell, this is level 1. This has been a quick look at the Asrock Creator TRX40. Hopefully you got some useful info.